Hi, I'm Ellie and welcome to my 2007 Toyota Hiace Arcadia, which I am almost finished self-converting into a camper van for traveling in, but there's a bit of a problem. My electrical system. Now, I touched on this in past videos, having a few issues with it, and I actually already filmed this video yesterday because I thought everything was solved and I thought this was going to be a kind of everything that went wrong and how I fixed it video, but instead this is going to be everything that went wrong and how I fixed some of them, but there's still something wrong and hopefully it gets fixed soon. I'm Ellie Wilder and you're watching Wilder in Motion. So pretty early on I decided I would get an electrician to install my electrical system, mainly because it had been so much research working out all of the individual components for the system I needed to buy. I didn't really want to fuss around with stuff like cable thicknesses and fuse boxes, and I just didn't want to do all that extra research, so I thought it would be easier to just have someone come and set it all up and then it would be done after one day. So I originally ordered all of the elements for my system a few months ago. This was made up of a 200 watt premium solar kit from Renogy, which included a 20 amp MPPT charge controller, as well as from a different company a 12 volt Life PO4 lithium 120 amp hour battery. And I also got the other elements such as my max fan, which I've already installed, and my 12 volt water pump. So if you'll cast your minds way back to before I even had my walls in, that was when the electrician originally came, because most people have their wiring in behind their walls and then they finish up the little bits like the light switches later on. However, the electrician ended up only wiring a few things on the day because he wanted everything to be mounted first, so we decided to have some ducting on the outside of the wall which the cables would be threaded through, and so I had to do all the walls and the furniture first and have him return, which brings us to the beginning of November, and that's when he came back and set everything up. And everything was working for about an hour. And then everything suddenly wasn't working for seemingly no reason. Nothing had changed, it just suddenly went out. So he did a few tests and he determined that there was power going into the charge controller but nothing coming out, and he believed that the charge controller was faulty. So it took about 2 weeks for Renogy to get back to me, but finally I got the new charge controller. It's just a few screws to put a few cables in, so I just did that myself to check, and it didn't work. Eventually I decided to see if the polarity was reversed and swap around the cables of the input, and I did, and it suddenly turned on. Now the reverse polarity thing was a little bit weird because it wasn't like the electrician had swapped anything over at any point, so presumably if they were in the wrong slots it shouldn't have worked at all. So it doesn't make sense why it worked and then it went out. So that's just a bit of a mystery, but since everything was working and the correct cables were in position, I decided to go on a little test trip. Everything was going totally fine until I woke up the next morning and the power had gone out. I noticed that the fridge wasn't really cold and the amp hours had reset and there was only 1 amp hour reading on my charge controller. And so I just thought, oh well, maybe the fridge took more draw than I expected. I'll just have to unplug it and see how it goes charging up the battery today. But what was worse is that it didn't seem to be charging up again normally either. There is a screen on my charge controller that shows me how many amps are coming from the panels into the charge controller and then onto the battery. And normally this sits between about 1 and 5 depending on how sunny it is. However, this was fluctuating between 4 to 8, flickering all over the place and then going to 0, and it would do this every 30 seconds or so. So it wasn't getting any kind of consistent input coming through and it was all very weird. However, it still somehow managed to charge back up to 57 amp hours again. So imagine my surprise the next morning when I woke up and the power wasn't just out. Everything was completely dead. Even the standby lights, everything on the charge controller had gone off completely, which didn't make any sense because there was no load on overnight. So supposedly there was 57 amp hours in the battery that has just disappeared. So at this point I decided it was time to return home. The test trip was over and it was kind of a fail, but at least I learnt something. But now I'm scratching my head as to what exactly had gone wrong. Along with this, the state of charge, which is an estimated percentage of how full the battery is based on the voltage of the battery, was showing 100%, but then my accumulated amp hours screen was sometimes only showing 6 amp hours. I finally got through to Renogy and they explained that the accumulated amp hours resets every single day. So it's actually a daily accumulated total, whereas the percentage state of charge relates to the actual total of how much available draw is within the battery. But it was at this point that someone who was helping me out noticed that while they were sitting on the error screen, when the amp started to flicker around and go really weirdly, an error would flash up with code 2, which is over voltage. Now, the panels were peaking at about 38 volt output, and this was really weird because the panels came with the charge controller. It was all a kit, and the charge controller says that the max input from the solar panels is 100 volts, so I don't know why it was struggling so much with 38 volts, but at least it was a fairly simple solution once we had worked it out, which was to buy some adapters and make the series system into a parallel system. And so with the configuration now in parallel, I parked the van in a nice sunny spot and plugged in the fridge to give it another test. And the fridge lasted overnight. Everything did as I would expect it to. I still had about 90% state of charge the next morning, a few hours into the day, so it probably would have topped up a bit again at that point. And then left my van about 5:30, went had a quick swim, came back about 8 p.m. and my state of charge had gone from sitting at around 85% at 5:30 p.m. down to 30% at 8 p.m. So the battery voltage had dropped. So I unplugged the fridge as to not completely over-discharge the battery whatsoever, but the state of charge continued to go down and the battery voltage continued to drop. So this is now the second time that the charge controller has gone completely out, standby lights and all. This doesn't make much sense to me because last night it didn't have any load on it. And the other thing is, isn't it meant to protect the battery from over discharging? I wouldn't have thought that it would have just gone cut out completely. So I've contacted Renogy to ask them if this is normal. I had just thought that this issue was related to the over voltage and the weird amps thing that was happening, and I thought that this would have been solved by the parallel thing, but clearly there is 2 separate issues that have been happening, or seemingly separate issues, and it seems like I've solved one, but the other one is still there. So I've got the electrician coming next week, so he's going to go through every single thing and identify, is it the panels, is it the charge controller, is it a dead cell in the battery, is it a faulty connection somewhere, and hopefully we'll find the root cause of the problem and finally be done with this. Well, I really hope you found this interesting or helpful, and I really hope that I am back next week with a finished van electrics video so I can show you how my system is actually set up and how it's all connected and what my choice of inverter and outlets and placement and lights and all that kind of thing is. So if you want to stay updated with that, be sure to like, subscribe. I'll see you next time.